the meaning of signals. According to the Angular website, a signal is a wrapper around a value that notifies interested consumers when that value changes. Signals can contain any value from simple primitives to complex data structures. You read a signal's value by calling its getter function, which allows Angular to track where the signal is used. I want us to take a closer look and compare and contrast between RxJS observables and signals. When it comes to setting states in signals, signals make it easily accessible in every level of an Angular application compared to observables, which requires a certain level of complexity to share data between different components. We're able to emphasize the need for the introduction of signals, which helps to resolve the issue of complexity and reduces the steep learning curve, because when you look at RxJS observables has so many operators that it will be very difficult for someone coming from a JavaScript background who hasn't touched any framework or library to wrap his head around the different RxJS operators we have, which I think is about over 100 different operators. So the steep learning curves that comes along with learning Angular, making use of observables, is what signals has come to simplify. To proceed with this, I would like us to take a look at a code example that compares signals to observables by creating a counter operation in Visual Studio Code. Now that we are inside of Visual Studio Code, before we get started, I just want to quickly explain the setting we currently have. So we have a new Angular project, and inside of this Angular project, we have a component called RxJS-Signals. This component has a template with a text of hello world, which is reflected in the browser on the tab on the right hand side. We're able to display the text on the browser because we imported the tag for that template inside our app.components.html file. Nothing difficult. I think that's totally clear. And with that, we can now start our implementation of our counter operation to help us to compare how state is being set, making use of RxJS observable in comparison with signals. So for the first implementation, we are going to make use of RxJS observables as well as behavior subjects. So to do that, we need to import behavior subject and take. So we can just import that above, as you can see, and down below we can create a variable called count, which also has a pound sign or a dollar sign rather, and then we can assign it to the new behavior subject and set the initial value to 0. Next thing we do, we create our function. So we're going to call this function counter, and within this function we're going to create a new variable called latest count. We set the initial value to 0, and then we're going to instantiate our count variable, which holds our behavior subject above, by saying this dot count with a dollar sign, and then we make use of the pipe and then make use of tick, which is going to be 1, and then we need to subscribe to this observable. Then we call an arrow function, which has a variable of x, and then assign latest count and set it equals to x. Then below, the final thing we need to do is to call next by initiating the this.count variable once more, and then calling .next, and then we can now say latest count plus 1. With this function, we should be able to create a counter operation that increments the value of our count variable. So to see this in action, we head straight to our HTML file and then get rid of the hello world texts, and we create a div. And within this div, we're going to create a text called count and make use of string interpolation, and then instantiate our count variable defined in our TS file and pass an async pipe to be able to display the value of the observable in the browser. Another thing we want to do is to create a button. So I'm going to type in button, and this button is going to hold the count function. So I'm just going to say click, which is the click event handler, and then I'm going to call the counter function, and then let's call the text counter. So I'm going to save everything we've done so far and wait for the browser to refresh. As you can see, we have a button called counter with count holding an initial value of 0. If I click on the counter button, you can see the value increases to 1, and then it keeps increasing as I click on the counter. So the next thing I'm going to do is to comment everything in the template as well as what we have in our TS file and try to implement this making use of signals. To do this with signals, the first thing we need to do is to define our variable. So we can do that by saying count is equals to signal, and signal is nothing but a function which takes in an initial variable. So the initial variable, just like we did in the observable, we set it to 0, and then the next thing is to create the counter function. But before we proceed, you can see we have an error which says cannot find name signal. This is because we need to import signal from @angular/core. So I'm going to import signal, and then that error disappears. So we can proceed to creating our function by typing counter, and then within the counter function, I can just say this .count.update, which is a method available when we define a signal. More information will be provided about this in the coming lessons for this module, but for now, let's just implement our callback by saying passing an arrow function and then typing C+1. So we can now save, and then in the templates, we can display the variable we set in our TypeScript by creating a div once more. And within this div, we can just say count, make use of string interpolation, and then call our count variable. And it's going to hold a parenthesis because signal is nothing but a function. Finally, we can now define our button by creating a button tag, passing in a counter text, as well as the click event handler, which helps us to call our counter function defined in our TS file. So we can now save, and then on the browser, we can see the initial value is 0. So once again, if I click on the button, you can see it increments by 1, just like we defined it in the TS file. And as you can see, the advantages of signals over RxJS is glaring. You don't need to subscribe. You don't need to pass an async pipe. The code syntax is elegant and simplistic in nature. I think with that, we've been able to exemplify the concepts of why signals is introduced into the Angular ecosystem.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.